Our scripture comes to us this morning from John's Gospel, chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. On the third day, a wedding took place in Cana of Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples were also there. Jesus and his disciples had been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied. "My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." And so they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best until now." What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. The last time I shared with you was in the season of Advent, just about a month ago. And during the sermon, we were hearing about winnowing forks and baptisms of fire. And my closing words to you that Sunday were, "We ignore John's words at tremendous peril." It was John the Baptist's words. That was it. No warm and fuzzy ending. It felt incomplete, as almost all of my sermons feel to me. Today we flip the script, and maybe, if we're willing, something more like good news can be found in what I shared. The scene is a wedding in Cana of Galilee. And not just a miracle, but an inaugural one, which is to say that it took place at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. It's a miracle that appears only in John's Gospel and is a bit of a scandalous one for teetotalers. You might remember David Wilkerson of the cross and the switchblade fame. Yes, I'm showing my age, but a lot of folks here are even older than I am, so. But it was a book and a movie, and it told the story of David's ministry in New York City and the radical conversions of New York City gang members and his preaching. Wilkerson later wrote a book called Sipping Saints, in which he makes the case for total abstinence from alcohol. And in straining to make his case, he even goes so far as to deal with this passage of Scripture that we read this morning by saying that it was not wine that Jesus made, and that first century Jews preserved grape juice by dehydrating it into a kind of jelly and rehydrated it when they wished to drink it. It's a reach, for sure. But if you have a pristine copy of that paperback, one that looks like new, I saw it listed for over $600. Now the paperback versions are about a tenth of that. As I imagine there are plenty of them out there. I distinctly remember reading through its pages while I was waiting for my dad to finish loading a load of hay so that I could haul it to the hay mound for unloading. But Jewish weddings did not involve grape jelly turned into grape juice. They were week-long affairs, and wine, real wine, was a part of the celebration. If you ran out as a host, you were going to be humiliated in front of your guests. In fact, you would be seen as cheap, as something like a thief. Such was the setting for today's miracle. Such was the framing of expectations. Now, Jesus received the news first from his mother, Mary, who from the text clearly expects Jesus to deal with the problem. Somehow. Jesus addresses her strangely, from our perspective, as we would not be likely to address our mothers in so generic a fashion. And indeed, if we did so, it would feel disrespectful. John is telling us, by presenting this, that Jesus' role was transcended from being Mary's son. And there are similarities, too, with Jesus' question in Matthew 12, when his family, concerned with his mental well-being, are trying to rein him in after hearing about his dramatic claims and teachings. On that occasion, he asks, "Who is my mother? And who are my brothers?" Now, much as Jesus has taken on a role beyond his family relations, the wine in this story takes on a role beyond that of a social lubricant. Where else does it do that? Well, in Holy Communion, of course, where it is seen as a sacrament and as a means of grace, and also where in most churches that I've celebrated it in, it was most certainly non-alcoholic. The first parts of this story are told sparsely. Compared to a work of literature, there's very little setting of the stage for the miracle, and a good amount of assuming that first century folks would have been familiar with the cultural expectations. Until, that is, we get to the vessels that are used for the wine. John records with specificity, I shouldn't use that word in a sermon, that the stone vessels used for ceremonial washing were pressed into service for their occasion. We don't know if any such vessels were still reserved for the task of washing, but we do know the number of jars, 6, their composition, stone, and their capacity, 20 to 30 gallons. These details are there for a reason. They're there to tell us that what we are celebrating with is not merely an abundant amount, but prodigious, copious, liberal, extravagant, and happily for the reputation of the host, generous provision for the wedding celebrations that remained. Furthermore, when the steward of the celebration sampled the wine, he was shocked. He was taken back. He was puzzled upon discovering that it was superior to what had been shared at the beginning of the feast, a hint of the kingdom inversion of expectations. The stone jars, vessels employed to serve a long-standing ritual tradition of ceremonial washing, were filled with wine, new wine, overloaded symbolically sometimes for us, but lest we forget the context, representing joy, abundant joy, in good measure and overflowing, accompanying the beginning of Jesus' ministry. In Rabbi Jason Sobel's commentary on this miracle, he notes that before the miracle took place, it was necessary first that the wine that had been provided ran out. This illustrates to him, and possibly to us, the exhausting of our resources, coming to the end of ourselves, so that we might be empty vessels for God's use. Now, for a good part of my young adult life, I've thought about that at a personal level, and perhaps too restricted to the personal. For today, I'm convinced that some professing communities have allowed human ideas and abstractions to displace what ought to be their orientation toward seeking the reign of God. In so doing, and there isn't time to go into all the varieties of this, but I will point to one. There are a large number of professing Christians who are sure that we are living in the so-called end times. And according to their take on this, we do not need to take care of the earth, for the planet itself is slated for destruction. And while I disagree profoundly with their eschatology, for it doesn't take into counsel the entirety of Scripture, even if we grant them the destruction part, how can they be so sure of the timing when the Bible tells us we can't be? But it also tells us we are to read the signs of the times. But furthermore, think about the cost of being wrong on that point. Given all that we know about where current trajectories are taking us, as coastlines are inundated and some of the world's poorest people will be forced to migrate. So in being wrong on this point, one that certainly by any stretch is a negotiable point in terms of interpreting the Scriptures, by being wrong on this point, we risk a violation of what Jesus described as like the greatest commandment, love of neighbor as we love ourselves. I've done it again. I've returned myself to the kind of warning from a month ago in Luke's gospel, but I assure you it won't stop there. In emptying ourselves, not just on an individual, personal level, but in emptying ourselves institutionally, let us consider the emptying as necessarily an emptying of ourselves of any commitments that interfere with fulfilling the greatest commandment. Love of God with all of our heart, soul, strength, and mind, and love of our neighbor as we love ourselves. I invite you to think of the possibility, by faith, of how God will work in and through us to bring the joy represented in the wine of the story, to bring the joy that he ministered to that little group in the first century, and to consider the possibility that he is ready to do the same for us.